thanks for the opportunity to speak, and I'll just say that a little bit about my background. As Kim mentioned, I'm co-chair of Asset Management BC. Done that for about 2 years, and they haven't put me in that position because I really know a lot about the technical aspects of asset management. It's more because there's a recognition that asset management, if it's to work its way through any local government or series of local governments, it's got to be both a bottom-up and a top-down approach to be effective. And so I'm a bit of a cheerleader, not as good as Kim, but I'm a bit of a cheerleader when it comes to asset management. And so in keeping with sort of the theme of this workshop, I thought I'd just give you a bit of background about how asset management and levels of service integrate in with some of the work that I think you're doing. First of all, of course, there was mention of the Stormwater Planning Guidebook. I remember when I looked at that a number of years ago, I was really impressed with it. I went back to university as a mature student and went to the University of Waterloo and got a degree in environmental studies and an honors in environmental and resource studies. And I think one of the first books I ever read was Earth in the Balance by Al Gore. And I was really impressed with some of the issues that were identified there. And of course, this is one of them. So this is the Bible. I've actually got it on my front of my seating area there. It's the International Infrastructure Management Manual. It's basically a joint copyright, how to do it sort of manual for asset management, and it was it's basically put together by NAMS New Zealand, which stands for National Asset Management Strategy, and also the Institute for Public Works and Engineering in Australia. These folks have been doing this for over 25 years. Along with the Brits, they're way ahead when it comes to asset management. Canada's catching up quickly, but we've got a long ways to go. So the term Umvelt, I like that term. It was something that came up at a CNAM conference that I attended about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It means the world is as it is experienced by a particular organism. It's the same environment, but each organism experiences the environment in a different way. And the Umvelt of asset management is basically more than what we typically call the triple bottom line. So it's more than a triple bottom line theory, but the entire external environment and or surroundings within which it is practiced. So in terms of the strategic context of municipal asset management, what you have there, of course, on your left is the triple bottom line approach. Essentially, actually I found in that manual there was a section on the triple bottom line approach to asset management that was done by the city of Saskatoon. It is a population of about 220,000. And they took an approach for, using the triple bottom line methodology for looking at their community water system. They called them corners, and they had a social corner, which includes a risk-based approach to providing service. They also looked at service level definitions that examine physical condition, capacity, service quality, and responsiveness to service interruptions. They had an economic corner, and that was looking at life cycle costs and growth and inflation budget projections, 10-year budget projections for all business activities. But this is all for one service. So they did a lot of work, and I think they were successful using that approach. But the Saskatoon approach, looking at one service, you can't look at services in isolation. Asset management is about a much bigger involved. So here's a sort of a high-level identification of some of the key other components of the asset management Umvelt, and you can see for yourself that they range quite a broad number of issues, that political goals, legislation, regulation, litigation. I won't read them all out, you can see them for yourself. Certainly climate change is one of them, and that's one of the things that really relates to what we're talking about here, the impacts of what's typically being called stormwater management, and I appreciated that section of the slide that Dean showed, which talks about rainwater management, and I think it's a great change in terminology, because recognizing that rainwater is a valuable asset is probably a very important thing in shifting the mentality in how we look at rain. I mean, that sort of brings to mind when I first got into local government, I was involved in solid waste. One of the sayings was that solid waste is a resource in the wrong place, and it's that kind of mentality that I think we have to try and bring to the way we look at asset management. Systems thinking. So the way to fully understand why a problem or element occurs and persists is to understand the parts in relation to the whole. So again, that's the Umvelt, that's the bigger picture. And basically, local government is a system. We deal with a number of services and programs, and asset management is a systems thinking method to organizational-wide problem solving. So somebody once said, I think it was Wally Wells, who's the executive director of Asset Management BC, he said, a lot of people get confused by asset management because they think, well, what is it? It sounds pretty esoteric. And he was talking to somebody who'd been, I guess, a CAO for 30 years, and he says, I know nothing about asset management. And Wally said, well, what have you been doing for the last 30 years? You've been managing assets. That's what we do. That's local government. But asset management as a system, as a program, is more about the systems thinking, the systems approach. Here's the local government efficiency machine. I'll read it out because it's hard to read. This is the most important slide in my presentation. Taxpayer sits on pneumatic cushion A, forcing air through A tube B, blowing balloon C into candle B, exploding balloon scares dog E, which pulls leash F, dropping ball G on teeter-totter H, launching plans I, which tilts lever J, then pitcher K pours water into plant L, causing it to grow, which pulls string attached to hand M that lifts the wallet out N. Anyway, so land development and watershed protection are indeed linked, and finding ways to strengthen that link is kind of what we're here to do, in my mind. When I look at that link, but I also look at it within the larger local government Umvelt. And so what is that? It's competing with all the other things that local government does. The assets are limited, both tangible capital assets and capacity. When I talk about capacity, I won't get into it here, but one of the big things that I think that we need to learn how to address more effectively is human capacity. And we're working at the City of Courtenay and just rolled out a pilot project related to an open source corporate capacity work plan that connects strategic planning, council strategic priorities with our corporate capacity in a project-based work plan that then feeds into the financial plan and generates some performance measurement tools and reports. So that piece that's missing often is we think often of capacity in terms of financial capacity, but also our limits are in human capacity. So services compete for and consume limited assets. Council determines which services are delivered. And very importantly, council decides levels of service, the amount of assets to assign to each service. So within the confines of our capacity, how much can we dedicate to any one particular service, including something like rainwater management. The other thing that's important to understand is that really levels of service are the fundamental building blocks of any asset management program. And while council determines or decides on the levels of service, really the next stage, or one of the most important stages in asset management in determining levels of service and performance measures that go along with that, is the customers or the citizens' willingness to pay. Because if you don't have those two connected, people will just say, yeah, I'd like a high level of service, but it's got to be balanced against what you're willing to pay for that service. Here's the other thing that's interesting about local government compared to the federal and provincial governments. Local governments are compelled by legislation to adopt balanced budgets. We cannot have deficits, and that puts a real constraint on our ability to do some of the things that we have to provide. And what's interesting about local government too is it's the closest to the people. It's the most responsive potentially anyway. But it also provides the most basic of services, so outside of healthcare, I suppose. So here's an example, because it helps to have a little bit of an example to understand. And I was trying to think of an example that could be used for rainwater or stormwater management, but I couldn't find one in the time that I had. But this is what would be used in terms of setting, let's see if I've got a little bit too far. So yeah, under the IMM approach to asset management, there's two types of performance measures. There's the technical or the customer performance measure. So for example, if you're talking, let's say, about let's say a water service. So you would establish a performance measure that was basically less than X service disruptions per year per property. That would be the performance measurement from the customer standpoint, because you have to think that the customer doesn't think like the operator, right? The operator looks at different criteria. The customer's the end user, and it's affected when the disruption of the service occurs. So you might set a performance target of less or greater than 99.9% of properties have less than whatever number you pick, right? The technical performance measure, you might say that less than a wide number of breaks per 100 kilometers of pipe per year, and then you'd set a performance target of, let's say, less than 50. So that's what you do when you're trying to establish levels of service. You're actually engaging the public and council in that discussion, and also your own staff in terms of, what's the difference for the customer standpoint and your operating standpoint. So this is the city of Courtenay's Umvelt, and there's stormwater management. Unfortunately, it's not really big. Rainwater management is now the term that I guess we should start to think about, and I like that. But what you have is this budget balance and capacity balance. And you have all the services that we have to provide, either by regulation or by choice. On the left-hand side, you've got the fulcrum in the middle, and then you have all the assets, the capital and human capacity, and financial capacity on the right. So that helps to, I think, give you a bit of a picture of the challenges that we faced in the greater Umvelt of local government. So there's a few things we are doing, and some of it mirrors what Comox has done and Surrey's been doing. I think we're just a little bit further behind on the progress of this, but we are making progress, and we're also making pretty good progress on our asset management program. But it takes time. Asset management is about moving along a continuum. You never actually arrive. you start with sort of a basic approach. You may not know where everything is, but you try and find out. Then you identify where it is. Then you work on your condition assessments. What kind of shape are your assets in? And this can apply for rainwater management or stormwater management. You have to know the condition of your assets so that you can use your limited resources in the most effective way to address the issues. So in the summer of this year, we selected a consultant to review and compare the specs, standards, design guidelines for stormwater management, amongst other construction standards. I'm certainly a big proponent for regional cooperation when it comes to establishing all these standards. I think it helps both the development community, in terms of understanding and knowing that they have the same standards or similar standards to meet wherever they are in the Comox Valley or in any region. So I think that's important, and we're working on that with our local governments in the region. So, just get to the page here. As part of the specs and standards design guideline approach, we hired Applin and Martin Consulting, well regarded, as I understand it, consultant on these standards. And they've been refining and reviewing other standards that have been used and developed along the same lines. I think Langley, Squamish, Prince George, and Campbell River have started down this path. To identify and baseline stormwater management criteria, basic principles of minor storm events. So looking at pipes, ditches, swales, and catch-braided basins. This is nothing new. You folks have been talking about this for a while, I'm sure. Looking at major storm event routing, typically considers overland flow routing. Ideally, if you can mimic nature and use swales and those sorts of things, on public lands preferably, but on private lands it's more challenging because you have limited space, and then oftentimes it's difficult to keep the maintenance standards up as you would on public lands, as I understand. We're also looking at alternate stormwater techniques, bioswales, rain gardens. You've heard about that in earlier presentations. Topsoil depth specs, and it was interesting to hear from Kim. I wasn't aware of the fact that, I heard something about it, but I didn't realize it was back as far as 2004 that the city was taking a lead in that. And of course, impervious surfaces. So yeah, we obviously we're looking to work with CAVI, the local CAVI group, and also you folks in terms of the interregional collaboration to get ideas for how we're going to move forward, how we're going to change our specs and standards and guidelines. Similar to what Glenn was talking about too, we're looking at developing a model. We're pretty close, we're not quite there. We've been working with the Comox Valley Economic Development folks on developing an economic model that shows the impacts, both pro and con, to proposed new developments. Often our political leaders see the benefits of development, but they don't see the costs. And I think part of the challenge there is it's that 20/80 rule again. And how do you because they see new tax, residential, commercial tax revenues. What I always say to them is, look, you've got to look at the long-term life cycle costs of all of this infrastructure that we do inherit in perpetuity, so that you understand what the real impacts are. And that's a challenge, but by doing the modeling, you can help them see the impacts, both pro and con. So, beyond the interregional deliverable is beyond the guidebook 2015. Clearly, I think there's opportunities to learn and to contribute to the affordable, effective, and adaptive approach. And it may fit well within Courtenay's overall Umvelt, but it is a portion. So I think what we need to do is to keep trying to find ways that we can support each other it's good modeling, good data, just ideas, and I think we learn a lot from each other. So thanks for the opportunity.